Okay, we're back. The next item on the agenda is is there a motion not to disclose the deliberations regarding the matters that were discussed in closed session?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Public comment, sorry.
And for the record, you should announce the settlement decisions that were.
Okay. Do we do that now or before?
If you do it now, it probably would.
Okay.
Commission announces that it is reached a settlement agreement in the following two complaints. Complaint number 28-101026 and complaint number 03-061016.
Public comment?
David Pilpel, that raises two issues. The settlements that were reached, are the material terms or the settlements themselves available at the present time? And if not, when will they be available? Whatever they were, I have no idea what those matters relate to.
Well, they were in closed session. They were confidential until they were adopted by the commission or proposed by the commissioners.
And are they not available at the present time? Or can the material terms be disclosed if the settlements have now been finalized?
You can disclose the material terms. My understanding is there aren't copies for the public, but
I think it's going to be difficult to, and the documents are not one-liners, so I think given that it'll be posted tomorrow, that's
At a minimum, could you announce who the respondent was, what the matters related to, just something? Because you obviously know what's going on and we have no idea out here.
yeah, I have no idea.
Complaint number 28-101026 is entered into by the Commission and Common Sense Voters, SF 2010, vote for Mark Farrell for District 2 Supervisor regarding a fail to provide full disclosure on a campaign mailing.
Okay.
The other one, 03-061016, is into between the MAC 06 committee, Jane Mack candidate and Francis Shea treasurer. And there were a long list of it's an extensive list of findings, which would take too long to read.
That's fine. I understand what they were related to now. That helps. Thank you. And then the other concern was with regard to the closed session. I was not here at the beginning. My understanding is that it's possible that Mr. Katz was present in closed session, and I'm trying to understand on what basis someone who's not a city employee could have been present in a closed session. If you can just explain if this was something prior to a preliminary hearing or the nature of the thing. I'm not interested in the basis of the complaint, just how someone might have been present who was not, who was just essentially a member of the public. That just seems odd.
You're entitled to your public comment. I mean, we had a matter that for which it was appropriate to be in closed session.
And the minutes will so reflect whoever was present in closed session, although not necessarily the full circumstances.
and the commission will consider the minutes at their next meeting.
Okay. Well, I guess what I'm expressing is that it is frustrating to not understand how someone can be present in closed session who, under a normal read of the Brown Act and the Sunshine Ordinance, would not be allowed to be present in closed session. And to the extent that the commission could explain that without going into the details of whatever the case is, that would be helpful and illuminating. If the commission can't do that, that makes it frustrating for those of us in the public who witnessed that and could give rise to further complaints. And I think that would be good to avoid.
Commissioner Luke?
There was no exception made to the rule. He was appropriately present. There was not an exception made for him to be present.
Then I guess I'm trying to understand under what rule such an individual could be present. That person is not a city employee, and if non-city employees are excluded from closed session, it doesn't reconcile. Okay, well,
Public comment, I mean, you have an opportunity.
I understand, and I appreciate that you're giving me a little more latitude on this. I just would think it would be nice if we could avoid that closed session giving rise to a further complaint and more processing on the commission's time. So this might be an opportunity if you can address that. If you can't, then so be it. No, no, it's not. It's actually not. I have other things to do with my time. Not me.
Feel free.
Okay.
I think all we can say is that there are other public policies at issue that prevent us from answering the question.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Other public comment?
See you soon.
Is there a motion? All in favor? Aye. We've made the motion to choose deliberations regarding confidential matters in closed session. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is continuation and consideration of possible amendments to CPRO. I believe where we left off, we were on decision point 7. Staff has recommended that we see decision points 7, C1, and C2. But that we start with decision point 7A.
May I also add that we, as a commission, also skip consideration of 7D. Upon a closer review of it, I think it really pertains to the D. 7D. So we recommend skipping 7C1, 7C2, and 7D because they pertain very much to the structure of the public financing program.
Okay.
I'd be happy to answer questions if you like. I'm not sure how you would like to proceed.
Can you introduce briefly the changes proposed in 7A?
Sure. Basically, what we want to propose is that we eliminate a requirement that candidates who want to seek public funds file a statement saying that they are interested in seeking public funds. This requirement is no longer necessary and actually proved to be a hurdle for a couple of candidates in the last supervisorial election because the election campaign fund is now funded through the allocation of $2.75 per resident. This actual provision in 1.140A1 and 1.42A are things that, I mean, they refer to a statement as really not necessary because we have sufficient funds now. Oh, generally speaking, we have sufficient funds, but these predated the funding of the election campaign funds.
So why does that relate to whether a person seeking public financing needs to file a statement that they participate?
What we needed to do early on in the public financing program was to get an idea of what the universe of candidates were going to be so that we could seek appropriate funding levels.
Comments from the commissioners on 7A? Seems pretty straightforward. Based on this investigation. Public comment? Is there a motion to adopt the changes proposed in decision point 7A?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Motion passes. 7B.
7B currently requires applicants for public financing to agree not to pay any contractor in exchange for contributions, and also to agree not to pay any vendors more than 50 payments. Staff recommends deletion of this because we don't think that this is necessary. There are rules that you can't pay for a contribution, and also the 50 payments amount seems pretty arbitrary. So you can make big payments through contributors, but you cannot make 50 small payments.
Any questions or discussion among the commissioners? Public comment on this item?
David Pilbell, I have no objection to eliminating this subsection C, lines 10 through 13. This does raise, though, a thought that has come from a few meetings that I've been at in the last few weeks related to public financing generally. I know that we're going to talk either tonight or at the interested persons meeting on Wednesday and thereafter about the appropriate threshold for participation, whether that's 5,000, 10,000, somewhere in between, how to qualify, all of that. But there was a thought that the amount of funds that were spent, both in this cycle and in general, don't necessarily get kept locally, that there were candidates and committees that purchased services through vendors, because this section was about contractors and vendors, out of town, printing, mailing, political consultants, whatnot, and that although we might not constrain candidates receiving private funds, those receiving public funds might have to agree, for example, to something like the local hire legislation that Supervisor Avalos passed. Shouldn't they spend, at least 50% of their funds on vendors in San Francisco, so as to keep the money and the jobs in the city? Are there other kinds of public benefits or restrictions that we might put on public finance candidates or those campaigns receiving public funds that may be environmental, social, that sort of thing? I think this was not necessarily in that basket, but I would encourage you to think about those kinds of provisions that one might appropriately burden publicly financed candidates with. I think that's a discussion that we should have, again, either Wednesday or thereafter.
Is there a motion? Take your time.
Hello, I'm Larry Bush. I just wanted to respond first of all to the question about directing campaigns and how they can spend the money. Is that there are state laws that say, for example, that if you're going to hire people to do robocalls into San Francisco, you are required to hire people who are out of state. That's a state law. I don't know what other laws there are, but that's the kind of thing you're going to look at. You might make sure that you're consistent with whatever the state requires. And as long as people are throwing out wish lists, I would say that I would like to see a requirement that says that at least one communication, however it's done, should go to every San Francisco voter. Because I think one of the points of public financing is to encourage greater participation. And we know that there is definitely greater participation when people are reached with a message about candidates. So it seems to me not an unreasonable thing to say that each voter should get at least one communication since voters are pay. And that's not relevant to your criteria.
Thank you, sir. Is there a motion with respect to the deletion proposed in decision point 7B?
I move that we accept the staff recommendation.
Is there a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes. The staff has asked us to hold off consideration of decision point 7C1, 7C2, and 7D. I also wonder, for the same reason, whether it makes sense to put off decision point 7E, because that amount could be changed depending on what the ceiling ultimately becomes.
Do you mean 7F? I'm sorry.
Yeah, 7F, sorry. 7F.
Yeah, we can certainly do that, yeah.
But I guess that leaves 7E. Probably do that. Ms. Ng, do you want to briefly?
Sure. 7E basically clarifies the audit situation. As you know, all publicly financed candidates must be audited starting from 60 days from the date that the first election report after the election is filed. So it has to be started within 60 days. But that same provision, or same section, 1.150A, also allows the Commission to perform other audits of other candidates, not necessarily publicly financed candidates. These could be candidates that are selected, candidate committees that are selected randomly, or candidate committees that are the subject of targeted audits. So what staff has done is rewrite 1.150 in a way that it makes clear that publicly financed candidates have to have their audits be done within 60 days. But the other audits could be started at a later time or at any time.
Okay. Comments from the commissioners?
Does even outside the 60-day window mean 6 months?
It could mean that. The reason it could mean that is like currently we have two auditors who are performing audits, and because they've been engaged in monitoring the public finance system in this election, they have not had the opportunity to perform any of the audits that need to be performed, especially for the publicly financed candidates from last year. While they have started them, they have not continued. They have not been able to complete them. So it's really a matter of staffing needs. What we intend is for the public finance candidates audits to begin, but the other audits, depending on our staffing needs and staffing availability, to have them start at a later time.
Sort of further to Commissioner Ward's question, I am a little worried that there's no sort of proposed time by which we would begin those audits. I mean, is there what would be a reasonable amount of time to allow the staff to audit those non-public finance
candidates? It's easy enough to start an audit and then just put it down and do anything. That's why somebody's taking one in New York. If you're concerned that we don't want to let people walk away from the campaign 4 years later, saying you could say a year or so. But if a campaign isn't audited and 2 years later we find out that there was some extensive wrongdoing, we should be able to go back and start something.
So So
in
how would
terms
you,
of-
how would you find that was wrong?
Sometimes people go back and look at old records and find things that were missed the first time around. It's unlikely. But if we don't audit a campaign, for example, and a lot of non-EF campaigns don't get audited, staff doesn't have a chance to review the records and see if everything appears to be done correctly. So I'm not, I understand what you're concerned about happening. And we certainly make every attempt to get those audits done as soon as possible, because we have elections every single year.
And let me just add that when we have random selection of audits, we do inform the committees that are selected almost immediately thereafter, and we tell them that they have to retain their records. We tell them what the law requires.
But how, so is it possible that after random selection, it could take a year or 18 months before the audit actually begins?
Yes, it could.
Any further comments or questions from commissioners?
I have a great reluctance to, in this case, vote for a measure that doesn't have a specific start time. Because it can extend out over what I think we all would agree could be an unreasonable period of time. And then you have, the possibility of multiple offenders, not multiple offenders, but serial offenders. If they're covering more than one election.
Do you have a sense of what would seem reasonable as an outer limit or more than create an edge?
I don't, but I suppose I'd just say maybe twice the current amount of time, 120 days instead of 60 days, but I don't know whether or not that makes sense.
I think the competing concern is that I worry that I agree that I would very much like to see a time limit or a time by which it must begin. But I am worried that if it's too short, then we're going to have the problem. We're going to have the same problem. That we're not going to be able to start them, so we're not going to audit as much as we'd like to. So maybe something like a year would meet that.
I would say, well, we're fine with that, but I would say the random audits have to be begun within a year. I'd like to leave the door open on the targeted ones.
And that is because
We only do targeted audits when we have evidence wrong.
oh, I see.
What's the parameter now for target?
There isn't enough. But you target audits generally because investigations are stalled while the audits.
Further comments? Public comment?
David Bilpel. Two things. I don't disagree. In fact, I'm starting to agree pretty strongly that one should start as soon as possible. I think it would be good to be explicit and add language here that says essentially that losing candidates get dealt with first because they tend to leave town or disappear or go into hiding. Candidates who win, even if they, whether or not they had to use public financing, they tend to be around. We tend to be able to find them. It's the people who lose and have caused problems, and the commission has actually had some experience of folks disappearing. So putting in language, prioritizing losing candidates would be helpful. With respect to the timing in general and targeted and random audits, if I'm reading this correctly, if it's within 60 days after the first post-election report. That's generally through the end of December, which is due like January 31st, February 1st. So it's within 60 days of that, so it's basically by April 1st-ish. It seems reasonable to me that by April 1st, after a November cycle, one should be able to start initiating an audit if it's a required audit. If it's something that comes up based on either being random or targeted based on evidence, I can see starting that later, but I would not, I'm agreeing with Commissioner Ward, I would not start that much later. Maybe by July 1 of that year. I mean, this is not for a general purpose committee, this is for a specific election-related committee, although the treasurer still has record-keeping requirements for, what, 5 years, I think? 5 years? 4 years? 5 years? If there isn't a good reason to start something by, like, July 1 of the following year, they should generally assume that they're done and they can move on with the rest of their lives. Again, unless there's some other evidence that comes up that requires something targeted. But even for the random audits, one should determine sometime in the early spring who's going to get nailed in a random audit and get started on it. Perhaps that helps. Thank you.
With respect to those suggestions, I think the suggestion to consider losing candidates is worthwhile and one that the staff can take into account, but I'd rather not. I'd be disinclined to tie the staff's hands.
It's already commission policy. Because we know where the elected people are going to be for the next 4 years. So we do those best.
And that's interesting, because I could make the argument that the people who are holding office are the ones in whom the public, I, as a member of the public, might have the most interest in knowing whether they had followed the rules, and that my confidence in office holders, the responsibility that office holders have, is actually greater than losers. So it may, I can see competing reasoning that might relate to the choice.
Hi, Larry Bush. I'd like to recommend that you add language that allows this to be revisited as technology improves. Because a great deal of auditing is going to have to do with technology and more reporting. And rather than lock yourself into a specific situation, at least allow a provision that says that every 6 months or every year, you'll review technology aspects for auditing and upgrade the audit system to incorporate.
With respect to the time by which non-publicly financed audits need to begin, do commissioners feel strongly that we need to put something in? Is that something we want to send the staff back with to figure out what that number should be?
That's what I would recommend.
I would agree. And maybe differentiate between
Could we recommend that it not be considered as part of this legislation then, so that on the provisions that the commission has already approved or will be approving, we could move forward to the Board of Supervisors with those and not have this as part of that?
Sure. So we'll essentially defer 7 years. Yes. So the next decision point is decision point 8. missing, would you like to?
Sure, decision point 8 is basically some refinements to the definitions section of the CPRO, and many of these come from existing definitions, and this is really a good way of consolidating provisions in the CPRO, and some of them also are new terms that we generally have talked about earlier, such as compliance costs, disclosure deadline that the Commission has already approved.
Any comments on decision point 8? Public comment? Is there a motion to adopt the amendments proposed by staff in decision point 8?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Decision point 9.
I'm sorry, I just had a clarifying question. Since we talked at the last meeting about the disclosure deadline, I'm having trouble relating the different documents. Does the new version have the new definition of the disclosure deadline?
The new version, I think it does.
It does, okay. And that was incorporated?
Yes.
Okay, right. I will have an opportunity to reconcile all this stuff before it. Thank you.
Okay.
Decision point 9 is basically a series of new electronic notice provisions requiring the Commission to provide email and online notice whenever the voluntary expenditure ceiling is accepted or lifted, or when the individual expenditure ceilings are lifted, are adjusted. This basically codifies existing practice. The only thing that what staff wants to do is to provide notices be sent by email only and not by regular mail. And generally speaking, this is what has been happening because all the candidates have given us their email addresses and we do this by email.
And have the candidates been voluntarily agreeing they don't need to receive it by mail?
Yes, yes.
Have you had any instance where a campaign has said, no, we want it by mail?
No. None that I'm aware of. I talked with Shyster Sheikh, who is the person who administers that program today, and she said no.
Any comments from the commissioners? Public comment? Public comment?
David Pilbel, I agree that it makes sense. I just want to be sure, and I'm not asking to get on that list, but if someone, some third party, interested person actually requested to receive mail notice, would the Commission say, no, we only do that by email, or would the Commission make some arrangement?
No, it's just, for that we would make an arrangement.
They would make an arrangement.
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, that we should also perhaps inform the press if we don't have a media list. Now, this doesn't require, for example, notifying the media. That would seem like an appropriate, audience of changes to the expenditure limits, or ceilings, excuse me.
The media may want it by mail?
No, that they may want it, that we may email them, but to the extent that we have a media list, if the ceilings are being lifted,
We do
that,
have a media list. That's why it goes out in the front of the press release.
okay. But this section doesn't require that notice to the media, does it? I'm not reading it there. But we're currently doing that anyway, and we would continue to. All right.
The media gets all press releases that we issue.
Great, thanks.
Is there a motion with respect to decision point 9? Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Decision point 10 is basically technical changes to section 1.160.5. And what it does is it deletes subsection C5, which provides for late filing fines, because that subsection really duplicates what's already in section 1.170. Staff also proposes a series of minor technical amendments, just to clarify.
Any comments from the commissioners with respect to decision point 10? Public comment? Is there a motion to adopt decision point 10?
So,
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Decision point 11?
Decision point 11 proposes to apply the prohibition on false endorsements to communications rather than just campaign ads. Communications is a broader term, and we believe that false endorsements, communications containing false endorsements are equally harmful whether they appear as advertisements or as communications. So it's just a broadening of the language.
Chantry.
Any other comments from commissioners? Public comment? Mr. Duffel?
Can staff just explain how this would play out in real terms with respect to the difference between a communication and a campaign advertisement? Is there an example that you can point to that is not currently prohibited that would be under this?
You can have a candidate say on his or her website, which is not a campaign advertisement,
Right.
that so-and-so supports him or her, when in actuality that's not the truth.
So this requires a heightened level of scrutiny for all campaign communications, so if they're going to say something, it needs to be verifiable and
Right.
accurate.
Correct.
Would this also govern third-party communications based on this definition? So an independent expenditure that says so-and-so is supporting this, if they can't back it up, they've got a problem. Okay. And I think that's good. I'm just trying to think through, are we creating other unintended consequences?
Well, it doesn't create an obligation in us to scour every one of them, but it gives us authority if we saw it or someone identified it.
But it creates an appropriate burden on all the various campaigns, their committees, their treasurers, everybody, to scrutinize stuff so they're not just putting things out there that are unverifiable and inaccurate. Right. But to the extent that that also applies to third-party spending, that's good. Right now, and there's no First Amendment problem with applying this to third-party spending? I'm not inviting one, I'm just...
That's a good question.
Our office has advised in the past, advised the commission confidentially on on First Amendment issues. Happy to do so again. At your request.
I'll just assume that it's not creating any new or big, right, okay. Asking people to be accurate is probably, a good idea. So if they want to argue about that and say, no, I have the right to be inaccurate and spend as much as I want saying whatever I want that's inaccurate, that would be a fun fight to get into place. Right. Thank you.
Okay, number of cases where people may think back to that.
I'm not going to law school.
Larry Bush, but back in the 80s, I did work for the Assemblyman Hard Actors who got voters to approve Proposition 20, which was the grounds for removal from office for for anyone who won elections by misrepresenting positions of their opponent. And the California Supreme Court ruled that invalid. So I don't know what impact that has. It's a good policy. Apparently it's not legal. So I don't know what impact that has on making a false claim in these circumstances. It certainly seems to me to have some bearing on the issue. By communications, when you say that, I assume that that includes things like door hangers, so forth, or is that already covered? Is it already covered?
Any communication that's distributed.
But up until now, has it been covered?
No.
Well, that's good.
I actually do have a question for staff. I'm looking at the actual language on page 39. And so was your intent to delete campaign advertisement or to add the communications, the broad definition of communication in addition to campaign advertisement?
The new definition of communication would encompass campaign advertisement, so the definition of campaign advertisement with all its exceptions was no longer necessary. You had the broader definition of communication.
Okay, because the only instance I could think of is if, because now you've added this distributed to more than 1,000 people, and I guess if you just broadcast, then the assumption is it's more than 1,000 people, or is that a threshold that you think is, I'm just wondering about proving it's been distributed to more than 1,000 people. If it's like a billboard, I would assume more than 1,000 people see it, but I don't know how you would quantify that. And so I'm wondering if we should leave in, to really encompass everything, leave in campaign, the sort of the first, but then add in what you proposed here instead of, I don't know, that's just a thought I had as I was reading through it.
So right now, the thought is that even with this broad definition, there's an ambiguity with respect to whether, for example, billboard would be distributed to them.
Right. Yeah. Or maybe not.
I mean, in
don't
fact,
know.
it wouldn't, it's pretty clear that it wouldn't be distributed.
Right, that was my concern, that looking at the language, not something that's distributed, just something that's posted or something that's.
So the definition of distributed, so on page 3, the proposed definition of distributed,
Okay.
on page 3 of the last month's proposed ordinance,
Right.
is any act that permits a communication to be viewed, read, or heard. And then, based on that distributed definition, we used that distributed definition throughout the proposed ordinance to try to find some examples of it.
Page 2 on 19, billboards included as under the definition of communication.
Right.
Okay, good, okay.
So I'm just looking for
You get
very important stuff
Okay.
that demonstrates it.
But would it make sense to say to 1,000 people, distributed to more than 1,000 people for, anyway, I'm thinking this through out loud.
So currently, there's no numerical threshold.
Right.
All right, looking for it. Right.
Right, so would it make, right, that's all.
How do you, so the question is, how do you implement a numerical threshold with advertising that is publicly displayed? Unless it's.
Why do we care about a number?
I think it's materiality.
There are First Amendment concerns, as Mr. Pilton, Mr. Bush expressed. And part of the way that this ordinance was crafted initially to address some of those First Amendment concerns is in the enforcement provisions, enforcement penalties on page 40. This false advertising restriction has its own enforcement provisions, narrow enforcement provisions with a requirement of a showing of clear and convincing evidence in order to address some of the concerns that they raised. So I think that's part of the threshold issue as well, in terms of what it makes sense for the city to go after. Does that make sense? If I say to Mabel, Catherine endorses David Pilpal for supervisor, that is a communication that I've just,
So if I might, a couple of things that have now come up. So looking at the definition on page 2 of whichever version of your communication, and any mailing, flyer, email, door hanger, without reference to sort of size, and maybe in some cases size does matter. So if you're doing, a mass mailing to 60,000 people, yeah, I think being accurate is important. If you're doing a fundraising letter to 50 people, do we apply the same standard? And if it's under 200 pieces, it's not a mass mailing. There's no filing requirement. I'm not even sure there's a record-keeping requirement. So, and I definitely understand billboards and sort of mass communications. What? And the same thing applies with respect to door hangers, pamphlets, some of these other things, where you've got sort of a large audience that matters, then yeah, absolutely. If it's a smaller size audience, should the level of scrutiny be the same, is my question. Maybe the answer is yes, we want everything to be 100% good and legit and all of that. Maybe not, and I'm not sure if we're at a point now of being that granular and needing to care. Maybe now is the time to be talking about that.
To the extent that there's a definition like mass mailing that has a number, might it be possible to keep that same sense of scope and say that that analogizes to it, that has the reach either of that number of items or for other matters that is intended to reach, or I'm groping for actually how to express it. But so the one phone call that is inaccurate doesn't count, but the 240-person robocall does.
And I think both recorded telephone messages and persuasion polls, we've established a threshold amount above which, at or above which we care, below which we don't care so much. And maybe depending on the type of communications in sub H, H2, we would want to say these things above a threshold matter and below less scrutiny.
How does this kind of discussion comport with the desire to move them through the board?
I think I would ask the question of what about multiple mailings that are different pieces, but with the same inaccurate information that are distributed over time, that cumulatively add up to a significant number, where alone they might seem insignificant, but you just change the color of the piece, put a different picture on it, and you change the language, but it still has that piece of inaccurate information.
Well, if I might, the definition of mass mailing in state law is 200 or more substantially similar pieces mailed within a 30-day period. So you could argue that even if you change the color and the this and the that, if you've got substantially similar text or some big chunk of it, that collectively you've done segments of what's now a mass mailing, and you're subject to all the things that you're appropriately subject to. That would be my take on it.
Yeah, I think the only issue is that the mass mailing rules cover mass mailing, and not TV ads and radio ads and other things that are maybe distributed once, billboards that are put up once and may reach an enormous number of people.
How did we come to 1,000?
But I do have a suggestion based on all the comments that have been made. On line 9 and page 39, perhaps we can say no person may spend more than $1,000 to pay for, direct, supervise, authorize, or distribute any communication that clearly identifies the candidate or measure is distributed within 90 days prior to the election for that candidate or measure and contains a false endorsement with a person that's full knowledge of possibility. So instead of having 1,000 people, which may be difficult to ascertain, you can put a price tag on it. It's $1,000 or more protected.
I wonder though whether this is one where we put off here.
We can do that too.
Let's say
What?
Miss Ham.
I think the $1,000 may have come because the staff may have wanted to be consistent. Under the persuasion polls, what triggers filing is completing at least 1,000 completed calls. I think there's the same provision, and it's not here, with the electioneering communications. I believe it's 1,000 in the electioneering communications. But I don't have it here. In terms of the billboard, trying to figure out how do you get 1,000, you could just put a presumption in the statute that it's presumed it's going to be 1,000 if you have a billboard, or if there's a radio, or a TV ad. You just build a presumption into the statute.
The only hesitation I have is that internet can slide through in the sense that the marginal cost of an email communication is so tiny that you can reach very, very large numbers of people with virtually no out-of-pocket or actual cost. So I don't know whether it needs to be, or it's terribly cumbersome, but if it could be, if this is what we're looking for, $1,000 or 1,000 people, because you would know that something went to 1,000 people. But, you know, some of them have a price tag and some of them could have no price tag. Which I know for the contribution side is a reason that you get so many emails.
Hi, Larry Bush. Just to illustrate the Commissioner's point, we just did internet ads in the Bay Guardian with 80,000 impressions that went out. It was $900. Would not have fallen under your threshold. We could have done things a lot cheaper too.
Okay, so unless there are objections from the commissioners, I would propose we table this one, see what comes out of each person's meetings. Okay, the next item is decision point 12. Ms. Amy, do you want to give us a brief?
Sure. Decision point 12 basically proposes deletion of sections 1.161, 1.161.5, 1.162, and 1.163 because these provisions would have already been incorporated in the new sections that were approved by the Commission at the last meeting. But this is basically a cleanup based on what the Commission did at the last meeting.
The last meeting in October?
Yes. When the Commission adopted the third party, validated a lot of these requirements for third party reports, for, yeah, consolidating a lot of these.
Comments from commissioners? Public comment on this item?
Well, I think I'm with this. I'm looking for a moment at the chart in the September 8th memo that followed. If staff could update this chart at some point so that there's, in my mind, for each type of activity, regardless of what section it's under, but the activity, and we sort of talked about this a moment ago, what's the disclaimer or disclosure requirement on the piece or in connection to the communication? That's item one. What is the filing obligation, if there's a filing obligation with the commission or FPBC or whoever? And third, that's not on this list, is what is the record-keeping obligation? So for each thing, so that we can all sort of understand what this is, you know, if you've got a recorded telephone message, you need to say this, you need to keep that, you need to do that, right? Some of this is captured and that's very helpful, but sort of getting it for each type of thing that's currently in the definition of the communication and whatever things that we can see possibly on the horizon would be good. I don't know, for example, in a...
Mr. Copeland, with all due respect, I
Sorry?
think this was meant, are you talking about this chart in Appendix A?
Yeah.
I mean, that was intended to aid our discussion of these regulations.
And what I'm suggesting is that a version of this would be very helpful for candidates, third parties, and other interested folks to understand how these play out in real time. That this is kind of the distillation of the thing. This is good stuff. But I don't know that it's yet complete because we've talked some more about, you know, billboards and other things. It's not, for example, obvious with a billboard. Yeah, I'm sure that you could put, you know, in 14-point type on a, you know, large-sized billboard paid for by Joe Smith for treasurer. I'm not sure that that deals with the intent of clearly communicating. So somehow it should say, you know, 14-point or something audible or visible in the medium that it exists in. Does that make sense? Okay. Anyway, whether or not it's done as part of this package, I would hope that staff would update this for future guides and other communications for folks so that the real-life examples are as clear as possible. Thanks.
Is there a motion? Is there a motion with respect to decision 312? Right. I move that we adopt the amendments proposed in decision 312. Is there a second?
I'll second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? 13.
13 is basically an overall approval of the draft amendments. So we attempted to talk to every major, address every major decision point. There may have been some minor technical amendments that we did not address, so hopefully this is a time for the commission to say, yes, we agree with the recommendations.
Comments from the commissioners? Public comment on this item?
Well, then just with respect to the last page, the operative date, I don't think that we're making January 1 here. If the commission votes on this in a moment, that would then get forwarded to the board. It would have to sit there for 30 days and wouldn't get enacted until at the earliest mid to late December, and then would take effect 30 days thereafter. So unless there's some reason to have a date certain in here, then you could eliminate that section and it would, by operation of law, take effect 30 days after final approval by the mayor. I mean, in practical terms, I don't know that there's going to be much campaign activity in early 2012. So I'm not sure that it matters that much. I'm just trying to think through if there are any finance implications, particularly if you take the action that you're contemplating on the next thing to delay certification.
I think the staff's intent was to originally, when we were looking at this in March, April, was to adopt it in September and then have it sit around and go into effect in January. So I'm tempted to say, let's just delete that language, except that it's our office's practice now to always include the effective and operative dates. And so I can stick in the boilerplate, I'm forgetting exactly what it would say, but basically the 30 days after approval by the mayor. So if you authorize me to do that, I think that's fine.
And I think the only other cleanup item is on page 1, line 17, section is in there twice. Page 1, line 17. We're here to help. And I'm sorry, just to the extent that you agree with all of these changes that have been made, if you vote and forward this out now, the items that you've reserved, either for staff for further review or for the IP meeting or some other process, those are not going forward with this package. This is just a package of, let's say, moderate cleanup stuff, but it doesn't, and it makes some substantive changes, but it doesn't make like massive programmatic changes. That is being held for those other things. Okay, so there may be several things in the pipeline to amend CFRO. Okay.
I think that's a fair clarification.
Okay. Very good.
There are other things in consideration.
Thank you.
Is there a motion to adopt decision point 13 with the caveat that we will clarify the effective date and in addition fix the typo on page 1, line 17?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes. Before we move on, just wanted to thank again the staff and the public for all your help with these, and we know that there is a lot of additional work ahead, and look forward to staff and public's findings and what we can learn about how to make the system work going forward in light of the new legal landscape. Thanks. The next item on the agenda is consideration of legislation to delay certification of gubernatorial candidates.
Because the redistricting commission may not finish their work until March or April, it could have an impact on some candidates' residency requirements. What this will do is hold off on distribution of funds until those lines have been certified by the redistricting commission. Candidates for supervisor will still be able to apply for funds in February, and the staff will be able to do all the paperwork and everything. But the actual checks won't be cut until we know what the final lines look like.
Comments from the commissioners? I agree with that sentiment. Public comment.
Well, Paul, I think I actually had suggested this a couple of meetings ago. So certainly with the concept, I'm just trying to, again, lay this out. So what's not clear is once, we, or those who draw the lines, do that, does the commission staff currently have a process to determine if someone is in the district? Because there may be like lines moved late one night and the person comes in the next day and says, where's my check? I would hope that the commission has a way to determine, and I'm not sure how that would be now, that someone is in the new district. Because they may get districted out, or, moved from one district to another. And although their paperwork may be in order, they may just, now be a block out of the district. So I don't think it's just a question of cutting the check. I think it's a question of determining eligibility, which is not just the monetary amounts, but it's actually their residency. And I'm not sure how quickly elections is going to be able to re-precinct and the thing based on the maps. I mean, we may decide on something and the meets and bounds, it may not be as quick and obvious as some might hope. I'm not suggesting delaying it further, I'm just sort of suggesting that staff have some plan in mind for how to make this work.
So I don't read this as providing the staff the deadline by which to make its determinations.
Staff still has to certify, but cannot do so until the lines have been drawn.
Right. After
And presumably-
the 15th. Presumably, the staff will do so after it's clear what the lines are. And so your overnight.
Right. So part of the certification process will in fact be verifying that the candidate is in the new district. However, that has to happen.
I don't think
That's not what I'm saying.
I don't think the staff verifies the residence of applicants for public financing. That's right. The candidate submits a declaration asserting that the candidate is eligible to run for office. And one of the eligibility criteria is the so it's not that they have to do an investigation to certify the accuracy of the qualifications.
But if I say that,
I was just going to say, I imagine that they look at the address and whether the address is within the lines, not a more complicated question of residency.
Yeah, no. I'm not trying to raise residency or citizenship or any of those issues, but just if someone says I'm, Arguello, and it turns out that Arguello is now not in the district, then even if they meet it for other reasons, it would seem to me like they cannot be certified because they're not eligible, they're no longer eligible to be a candidate.
But that doesn't sound like it, is it? That's nothing new. They now have to currently get the certification that the person meets all of those. And I don't think this changes it. It's only that if they were to do it before this date, they might make one that's no longer appropriate to the new district.
Okay. So part of it is the address. The other is if someone really ends up being like in or out by a block, but the entire shape of the district changes, which is possible. Although they might have gathered funds and qualified, they might choose to end their candidacy right there because they don't think that they are viable anymore in the newly constituted district. So to the extent that someone has filed paperwork that's on hold, there might be an additional step to contact them and say, are you still going forward and shall we complete your certification? If so, we'll get back to you because we're working through it now. But if you choose to end things now, you may do that as well. I'm just trying to think through these possibilities. And in some districts, that's perhaps more possible than in others.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it's procedural.
Yeah.
More, and it's not something that we need to, we need to make a decision whether or not we delay funding, but the rest of it is procedural, and the staff can find a way to process about be aware and create a process for the candidates.
Yeah, I think your concerns are noted, and I understand that. That's okay.
Yeah, no, I don't think it gets in the way of the legislation. It seemed like this was the right time to raise that, because I don't know if staff is going to be promulgating any regs or doing something to better define certification in this context, so I think my points have been made. Thank you.
Is there a motion with respect to the draft legislation to the May certification?
I move that we accept the recommendation.
Second? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Excellent. Next item on the agenda is the minutes of the meeting. Any proposed changes? Commissioners? Phil?
The only thing I found so far is on page 7, Anita Mayo is misspelled. Scandalous, I know. Thank you.
Any other changes proposed? Is there a motion to adopt the minutes as amended on page 7 to correctly spell Anita's name?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes. Agenda item 10, the executive director's report.
I just want to point out that the revenue report is last month's numbers because there were 2 staff members out when this report was produced. Both of them are the ones that have the capability to run that report. We'll have updated numbers next month. Staff is kind of exhausted. I did testify at the Government Audit Oversight Committee last week, where they did unanimously adopt legislation requiring Ethics Commission hearings to be televised. The Supervisor Campos wanted it amended to include the Sunshine Task Force, but was unable to do that. I understand he's introducing a separate legislation, just for your information. The only other, so we're all set for televised meetings starting in January. See, here I go again. The 4th Monday, not the last Monday, the 4th Monday. They're not always the same. And all of us are due for our state mandated anti-harassment training. So I will be sending you instructions for how to do that. It's an online tutorial that you watch, and then there's a certificate generated at the end of a quiz. So I will be sending you step-by-step instructions to do that. That's it.
Thank you, and thank you to the staff for getting us through a busy election season. Appreciate all the hard work we know went into it. Items for a public comment on the
David Popel on item 4, the page 4, item 6, sorry. The reference to Prop F, I believe that in fact Prop F did fail, so it's not on your agenda tonight, but perhaps you want to bring that up at a future meeting to decide what to do about that. I assume that we're just going to continue to live with the ordinance as it is for the moment, and whether or not we try again in next November or attempt to make changes, hear the opponents do something, might be worth talking about. It was certainly good enough to put on the ballot, and we're still stuck with what we're stuck with, so kind of figuring out what to do next probably would be a wise thing into a future meeting.
Larry Bush. Since Proposition F was brought up, I'd just like to say that I was a member of the group that worked to oppose Prop F. It did lose by 57%, 43%. We met with over 30 community groups who ended up voting to oppose Prop F, largely because of their feelings about the Ethics Commission. There was not a problem so much with any of the technical aspects of it. It was the one provision that said that the Ethics Commission could later on make other adjustments with the approval of the board and supermajorities in both cases. And I think that all the people who were involved in this, included 5 former ethics commissioners, would be happy to talk to the Ethics Commission about what the issues were and ways in which to move forward. Because I think that there is general agreement that the campaign consultant ordinance does need to be updated in many ways. But there also are concerns about issues that have come up in the past year with the Ethics Commission, as you know, from the civil grand jury thing. This particular makeup of commissioners have made a number of steps that have been well received in the community, but we still have what I guess we call a political hangover of a record that is less satisfactory. You're working your way out of that, but there's still a number of issues that need to be addressed. So on behalf of Friends of Ethics, as we call ourselves, we'd be happy to speak individually or with others in the group about the issues that we've heard when we're out talking to people who voted not to vote. It won't be much.
Commissioner Ward has announced that he is, maybe I should let Commissioner Ward speak.
Well, this is likely to be my last meeting. I've submitted my resignation. Been on the Ethics Commission now for 6 years, so it's probably time for me to step aside and let someone else do their public service. I've appreciated and enjoyed the opportunity to work with all of you and actually all of the other commissioners that have come through during the time that I've been here. I've especially appreciated all the support and fine work that the staff has done while I've been on the commission. And I think that public service is important. This is the second commission that I've set on. So I've served, probably more than 10 years as a volunteer on commissions in the city. As Shirley Chisholm once said, it's the rent that we pay for being here. So I've done it willingly. I suppose if I'm called upon sometime in the future to serve on another commission, I would seriously consider doing that. But I'm going to miss you all. But between September and January on Monday nights, I'm going to be watching Monday Night Football.
Well, Commissioner Ward, I think I speak for my fellow commissioners when I say that we've greatly appreciated your service and your wise insights and pragmatic approach to the issues that we face. And I know I personally have learned a great deal about serving on this commission from you and cherished your comments and guidance on all these issues.
And I just want to say from me and the staff to thank you very much. Your intellect and your insights have been great. You challenge us a lot. You challenge our thinking, and that makes us, want to work hard to be prepared and to be ready. And that's a great thing because keeping us on our toes is the best thing we can do for the folks on the staff. And so we always like that you have, terrific insights and always look for the motivations behind behind things. It's been a learning, growing experience that we've enjoyed. And sincerely, we'll miss you.
I'll come back and visit. I'll come in.
Come and make public comment.
I'll come, yeah, I'll come and make public.
You'll make excellent public comments.
We're going to hold you to that and continually ask for your presence. Thank you very much. Is there items for future meetings?
I have a question, which I think fits here. There's been some public comment, editorials and so forth about the public finance system that San Francisco has. I just wonder if there are any limitations or constraints on commissioners conversing about that issue. Either if it comes up or if we want to seek inquiry, if we were invited to talk about it.
No, it's, the limitations on the commission and the commission staff are non-political, but educational and dissemination of factual information, the receipt of opinions and input is encouraged.
What about dissemination of opinions? Could be an issue.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time the commissioners expressed opinions about commission business off campus.
Or could, or might be in the categories you were describing now, but at some point be unvalidated.
We talk about it
Just,
until
when it,
like Prop F. We could talk about Prop F while we were just discussing it, but once it became a ballot measure, our lips were effectively sealed.
it does seem that that's a conversation that our community may be having in the days to come.
In addition, I know I've said this before, but I do very much look forward to the results of the interested persons meeting with respect to the secret amendments. I mean, there are big sort of systemic issues we should probably be considering. I think the best to consider those as soon as we feel ready to do so. Is there a public comment?
Larry Bush. I'd like to suggest that the commission schedule a conversation about contractor prohibitions in the way in which they can. It remains an outstanding issue. It was an issue that came up in the course of this campaign, but I think that the issue is also larger about the fact that contractors, while prohibited from making direct contributions, are permitted to solicit others to make contributions, can serve on finance committees, can be butlers, and all the rest of that. And I'm not sure that that's, I think that's a topic that deserves a discussion by the commission. And I'd like to recommend that we do that.
David Pilpel, I just want to touch on what Larry suggested to broaden it a little bit, having been involved in several campaigns, including one in this past cycle as a volunteer. Campaigns often get checks from a variety of sources. Some are individuals, some it's not clear. For cash flow and other purposes, campaigns often want to rush to the bank and make, copy the check, rush to the bank, make the deposit, so that they have money available, and if there's a problem with it later, they'll pay it back, pay the fine, fundraise it, whatever they have to do, but at least they'll have the funds available initially to do whatever it is they're doing. I think that kind of makes sense, but it ought to be very well tempered with, is this a legal contribution that I can accept and deposit, which sometimes they're interested in, sometimes they're less interested in, and whether it's a contractor contribution, someone who's over the aggregate limit, a business entity that could be a corporation, might not be, isn't entirely clear, that it's a check that's a trust and it's from a trustee, or you can't tell whether it's the husband or the wife who signed the thing. I think that there are some steps or some guidance that the commission could give to campaigns and treasurers about how to validate a contribution, and to the extent that it can't be validated quickly, to put it aside and do some more diligence. Again, some are better at this than others. Some that have professionals are better and have ways to deal with it, but there are a number of campaigns, and we've referenced this in past meetings, that don't necessarily have professionals, don't have a lot of support people, and they're just like, hey, we got a $500 check, let's go deposit it. And I am often a lonely voice saying, well, you really ought to be sure that it's a legal contribution before you run off to deposit it. And so some advice on how to deal with that as broadly as possible, I think would help the community and really promote compliance. I would rather they do it right rather than have to pay a fine and pay it back later. Let's have them do it right the first time. Anyway, anything that one can do to help would be good, and not just in guides, but in real, examples. Thanks.
Is there a motion to adjourn the meeting?
I think we should let Charles.
I move that we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.